Ma'am, put the phone down and step away from the building. I'm not asking again.
Officer, I'm on a public sidewalk. Tell me
Turn
the
around.
time, right now.
You're casing windows.
No.
Drop the bag and give me your ID.
No reasonable suspicion. I do not consent to a search. This is unlawful.
Turn around. You're obstructing.
I am not resisting. You're violating my...
Ma'am, put the phone down and step away from the building. I'm not asking again. The voice cut through the crisp mid-morning air like a jagged knife. It was aggressive, loud, and completely out of place on a sunny Tuesday at 10:30 a.m. in the heart of the financial district. Elara Vance didn't flinch. She didn't drop her phone. She didn't even look up immediately. At 54 years old, with her salt and pepper hair pulled back into an immaculate chignon and wearing a tailored navy suit that cost more than most people's first cars, she was not accustomed to being addressed like an unruly teenager. She was reviewing a complex motions docket on her tablet, waiting for her double espresso and a colleague from the U.S. Attorney's Office. "I am talking to you. Step away from the wall." Elara slowly lowered her tablet. She turned her head, her movements deliberate and calm, to face the source of the noise. Standing 10 feet away was Officer Brody Miller. He was young, maybe 29, with a high and tight haircut and a posture that screamed he was looking for a fight. His hand was resting dangerously close to his holster thumb hooked over his belt, chest puffed out. "Officer," Elara said, her voice possessing the cool, resonant timbre of someone who had spent 25 years speaking in federal courtrooms. "Are you addressing me?" "I'm addressing the woman loitering outside a business and casing the parking lot," Miller snapped, closing the distance between them. "I've been watching you for 5 minutes, walking back and forth, looking into the windows, checking your phone. We've had break-ins in this district. You need to explain what you're doing here." Elara adjusted her glasses. "I am waiting for a coffee," she said simply. "And I am reading work documents. Pacing while reading is a habit, not a crime." "It looks like casing to me," Miller retorted. He was close enough now that she could see the nameplate on his uniform, B. Miller. He looked like the type of man who had never been told no in his life, or at least never accepted it with grace. "I need you to set your bag on the ground and give me your ID. Now." Elara looked at the leather briefcase at her feet. Inside were sealed grand jury indictments, sensitive personnel files for the Southern District, and her personal effects. There was absolutely no way this officer was touching that bag. "Officer Miller," Elara said, turning her body fully toward him, but keeping her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "You are making a significant assumption. I am standing on a public sidewalk during business hours engaging in lawful behavior. You have no reasonable suspicion that a crime has been committed, is being committed, or is about to be committed. Therefore, I am not obligated to provide identification or consent to a search." Miller blinked. He hadn't expected legal terminology. He had expected fear. He had expected a scramble for a driver's license and a stammered apology. Instead, he was getting a lecture from a black woman who looked like she owned the building behind her. "Don't play lawyer with me," Miller sneered, his face flushing a light shade of pink. "Refusing a lawful order is obstruction. Now for the last time, ID." "It is not a lawful order if the stop itself is unconstitutional," Elara replied, her heart rate remaining steady despite the adrenaline beginning to sharpen her senses. She had watched federal judges dress down attorneys for less incompetence than this. "I am a private citizen conducting private business. Unless you can articulate a specific crime, I am suspected of this conversation is a consensual encounter, and I am choosing to end it." She turned back to her tablet. It was a dismissal, a clear signal that she was done. But for Officer Brody Miller, it was an insult he couldn't abide. "Turn around," Miller barked, reaching for his radio. "Dispatch. Show me out with one uncooperative female 400 block of Maine. She's becoming belligerent." Elara sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. She tapped the screen of her phone, ensuring the voice recorder was running. She had hoped to enjoy her coffee. Instead, she was about to teach a master class in civil rights law, whether Officer Miller wanted to attend or not. The atmosphere on the sidewalk shifted instantly. The casual hum of the city traffic, distant construction, the murmur of pedestrians seemed to drop away, replaced by the sharp tension of the confrontation. A few people walking by slowed down. A man in a gray suit stopped near the entrance of the coffee shop, sensing something was wrong. "Officer," Elara said, keeping her voice level but raising the volume slightly so the gathering witnesses could hear. "You just reported over the radio that I am being belligerent. That is a false statement. I am standing still. My hands are visible. I am speaking to you calmly. You are fabricating a narrative to justify an unlawful detention. You're refusing to identify yourself," Miller argued, stepping into her personal space. He was trying to intimidate her physically, using his height and bulk to tower over her. In this state, failure to identify during an investigation is an arrestable offense. "During a lawful investigation," Elara corrected him, not taking a single step back. "Hebel v. 6th Judicial District Court of Nevada. The Supreme Court ruled that stop and identify statutes only apply if the initial stop is based on reasonable suspicion properly specific to the individual. You have not articulated that. Looking at windows while waiting for a coffee is not a crime. It is not even suspicious. It is what customers do." Miller's jaw tightened. He wasn't listening to the case law. He was hearing defiance. He was hearing a challenge to his authority in front of an audience. "I don't care what you think the law is," Miller spat. "I'm the one with the badge. I'm telling you that you match the description of a suspect involved in vehicle break-ins." "What description?" Elara asked sharply. "Because 5 minutes ago you said you stopped me because I was pacing. Now suddenly I match a description. Which is it, officer? And let me guess the description. Black female that covers half the population of this city. Is there a height, a weight, a clothing description? Because I am wearing a $2,000 suit and heels. Is your car burglar wearing Italian silk? You're resisting," Miller shouted, his hand moving to his handcuffs. "I am not resisting," Elara narrated for the benefit of the witnesses and her own recording. "I am verbally asserting my Fourth Amendment rights. I am not fleeing. I am not physically pulling away. I am questioning the validity of your authority in this specific instance." "Last chance," Miller growled. "ID or cuffs." Elara looked him dead in the eye. She saw the uncertainty behind his aggression. He knew deep down that he was on shaky ground, but he had gone too far to back down without losing face. He was trapped by his own ego. "My identification is in my bag," Elara said. "However, I am not giving it to you because you have not met the burden of proof required to demand it. If you arrest me, you will be violating clearly established law, you will lose qualified immunity, and you will be sued." "That's it," Miller snapped. He lunged forward, grabbing Elara's left wrist and twisting it behind her back with unnecessary force. "I am not resisting," Elara said loudly, wincing as her shoulder joint was torqued. "I am complying with your physical force. Witnesses, please note I am offering no resistance." "Stop fighting!" Miller yelled, a tactic trained to make bystanders believe the suspect is the aggressor. He shoved her against the brick wall of the coffee shop. Her cheek pressed against the rough masonry. "I am not fighting," Elara stated clearly. "You are assaulting a federal employee." Miller paused for a microsecond as the words registered, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He clicked the first cuff onto her wrist. "Federal employee." "Yeah, right. And I'm the president. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and disorderly conduct." The cold metal bit into her skin. Elara closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. But she knew that anger was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She needed to be perfect. She needed to be the calmest person in the equation. "You are making a mistake that you cannot undo," she whispered, her voice like ice. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting tight was sickeningly loud. Bystanders were now openly filming. The man in the gray suit had his phone out, holding it horizontally, capturing the entire scene. A woman near the curb shouted, "Hey!" She wasn't doing anything. "We saw her just standing there." Officer Miller ignored them. He spun Alara around, grabbing her by the bicep. "You can tell it to the judge," he muttered, pulling her away from the wall. "I work for the judges," Alara said, her voice dropping to a dangerously low register. "I have been the senior court clerk for the United States District Court for 19 years. The bag you just kicked contains sealed indictments signed by the chief judge this morning. By arresting me, you are technically interfering with federal judicial proceedings." Miller faltered. His grip on her arm loosened slightly. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. The suit, the poise, the way she spoke. It wasn't the frantic speech of someone caught doing something wrong. It was the controlled diction of someone who knew exactly how the system worked because she helped run it. But the crowd was watching. The cameras were rolling. If he let her go now, he would look like a fool. He would be admitting he was wrong. "Yeah, sure," Miller blustered, doubling down on his error. "Everyone's got a story. You're coming downtown. If you're who you say you are, it'll get sorted out. But right now, you're going in the car." He marched her toward his patrol cruiser parked illegally in a loading zone. Alara walked with her head high. She didn't struggle. She didn't cry. She walked with the dignity of a queen being led to the guillotine, knowing full well that the executioner was the one who would eventually lose his head. "My bag," Alara said. "It contains sensitive federal property. If you leave it on the sidewalk, that is a separate federal felony." Miller groaned, annoyed. He dragged her to the car, opened the back door, and roughly guided her inside. The hard plastic seat was uncomfortable, and the space was cramped. "Sit tight," he said. He walked back, grabbed her leather briefcase, and tossed it onto the front passenger seat of his cruiser. He got in the driver's seat and slammed the door. The interior of the car smelled of stale coffee and sanitizer. Through the partition, Alara watched the back of his head. She saw him check his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked flustered. He was breathing hard. "What's your name?" Miller asked, starting the engine. He didn't turn around. Alara said nothing. "I asked you a question. Name and date of birth." Alara remained silent. She had told him her identification was in the bag. He had chosen to arrest her instead of investigating. Now she would exercise her right to remain silent until she had counsel or until she was in front of a supervisor who had the brain power to understand the catastrophe unfolding. "Fine. Be that way. We'll fingerprint you at the station. See if you have warrants." He pulled out into traffic, cutting off a delivery truck. Alara noted the time on the dashboard clock, 10:42 a.m. She noted his speed, 45, in a 25 zone without lights or sirens. She noted that he hadn't seatbelted her in a violation of department safety policy. She was building a file in her mind. Every second of this encounter was being cataloged, indexed, and cross-referenced with department policy and constitutional law. Officer Brody Miller thought he was driving a suspect to booking. In reality, he was driving his career off a cliff. The drive to the precinct took 12 minutes. For Officer Miller, it must have felt like an eternity. The silence from the back seat was oppressive. Usually people in the back of his car were screaming, crying, begging, or cursing him out. They kicked the doors. They spat. They offered bribes. Alara Vance did none of those things. She sat perfectly still, staring at the back of his neck. Miller turned on the radio to drown out the silence, but the chatter of the dispatcher only seemed to amplify the tension. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were locked on him. They weren't angry eyes, not anymore. They were analytical. It was like being examined by a coroner while he was still alive. "You know," Miller said, trying to break the tension, trying to convince himself he was in the right. "If you had just shown me your ID, none of this would have happened. You did this to yourself." Alara didn't blink. She didn't respond. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was soliciting an admission. He wanted her to say, "I know I'm sorry," so he could put it in his report. He wanted absolution. She would give him nothing. Miller shifted in his seat. The doubt was creeping in now, cold and slithering. What if she is telling the truth, he thought. Federal court clerk. No, that's impossible. She was just standing there. She fits the profile. But the profile was weak, and he knew it. Black woman near a building wasn't a profile. It was a prejudice. He pulled into the sally port of the downtown precinct. The heavy metal doors rolled down behind them, sealing them inside the concrete belly of the station. He put the car in park and took a deep breath. "All right," he said, feigning a confidence he no longer felt. "End of the line. Let's get you processed." He got out and opened the rear door. He grabbed Alara's arm again to pull her out. "I can walk," she said. It was the first thing she had said in 20 minutes. The authority in her voice made him let go of her arm instinctively. She stepped out of the vehicle, straightened her jacket as best she could with her hands cuffed behind her, and looked around the bay. A few other officers were unloading suspects. They looked at Alara dressed in her power suit, looking utterly out of place amidst the drunks and the petty thieves, and then they looked at Miller. Their expressions were puzzled. Miller grabbed her briefcase from the front seat. "Let's go." He led her through the heavy security doors and into the intake room. It was a loud, chaotic space filled with the smell of sweat and industrial cleaner. Behind the high desk sat Sergeant Thomas, a man with 30 years on the job, a thick mustache and eyes that had seen everything. Thomas looked up as Miller approached with Alara. He looked at Miller. Then he looked at Alara. He looked at the expensive suit. He looked at the handcuffs. He looked back at Miller. "What do we have here, Miller?" Thomas asked, his voice gravelly and suspicious. "Refusal to identify obstruction disorderly," Miller recited, placing the leather briefcase on the counter. "Suspect was casing vehicles in the financial district, became belligerent when approached." Sergeant Thomas looked at Alara. "That true, ma'am. You were casing cars in a $1,000 suit." "I am invoking my right to remain silent," Alara said politely. "However, I would ask you to open that briefcase and look at the identification in the front pocket. I believe Officer Miller failed to verify my identity before initiating this arrest." Thomas raised an eyebrow. He reached for the bag. "Be careful, Sarge," Miller said. "She claims she's some federal big shot." Thomas shot Miller a look that said, "Shut up." He unbuckled the leather flap of the briefcase. He reached into the front pocket and pulled out a slim leather wallet. He opened it. The room seemed to go quiet. Thomas stared at the credentials. He saw the Department of Justice seal. He saw the holographic overlay. He saw the card that read Alara Vance, Senior Clerk of Court U.S. District Court, Southern District. He saw the secondary card, Top Secret Security Clearance. Thomas slowly closed the wallet. He looked up at Miller. His face had gone pale. "Miller," Thomas said, his voice very, very quiet. "Did you read this ID?" "She wouldn't give it to me," Miller said defensively. "I told you she resisted." "You detained a federal official," Thomas said, sliding the wallet across the counter so Miller could see it. "And not just any official. This woman runs the chief judge's docket. Do you know who signs our search warrants, Miller? Do you know who signs the wiretap authorizations you guys beg for every week?" Miller looked at the ID. The blood drained from his face. "Senior Clerk of Court." "Oh," Miller whispered. "Yeah. Oh," Thomas said. He picked up the phone on his desk. "Watch Commander. Now." The intake room was usually a place of noise and movement, but a strange bubble of stillness had formed around the intake desk. Other officers sensed the disaster and stepped back. No one wanted to be near the blast radius of what was about to happen. Officer Miller stood frozen, staring at the credentials. I didn't know," he stammered. "She didn't tell me." I told you exactly who I was, Alara said. Her voice was calm, cutting through his excuses. I told you I was a federal employee. I told you I worked for the courts. You told me you didn't care. Uncuff her, Sergeant Thomas barked at Miller. Right now. Miller fumbled for his keys. His hands were shaking. He stepped behind Alara and unlocked the handcuffs. As soon as her hands were free, Alara rubbed her wrists. There were deep red indentations where the metal had dug in. I need photographs of these injuries, Alara said to Sergeant Thomas. For the file. Ma'am, we can... Miller started. Quiet, Thomas snapped. You don't talk anymore, Miller. You stand in the corner and you wait. The door to the intake room swung open and Lieutenant Henderson, the watch commander, strode in. He was a tall man with graying hair and a permanent scowl. What is the problem, Thomas? I've got a briefing in 10 minutes. Problem is an understate, Lieutenant, Thomas said. He gestured to Alara. Officer Miller here just arrested Alara Vance. Lieutenant Henderson froze. He knew the name. Everyone in command knew the name. Alara Vance was the gatekeeper. If you needed a warrant at 3 a.m. on a Saturday, you called Alara Vance and she woke up the judge. She was a legend in the legal community for her efficiency and her zero-tolerance policy for incompetence. Henderson looked at Alara, then at the red marks on her wrists, then at Miller, cowering in the corner. Ms. Vance. Henderson said, his voice changing instantly to a tone of deferential panic. I am incredibly sorry. There must be a massive misunderstanding. There is no misunderstanding, Lieutenant, Alara said. She reached into her bag, checking that her files were undisturbed. Officer Miller profiled me, detained me without reasonable suspicion, assaulted me, and arrested me for asserting my constitutional rights. It was quite clear. We can release you immediately, Henderson said quickly. This never has to go on paper. We can call it a consensual transport. We'll get you a car back to your office right now. Alara laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. Lieutenant, do you really think I'm going to let you unarrest me so you can bury this statistics? She shook her head. No. You brought me in. You booked me. I want the booking sheet. I want the arrest record. I want the mugshot taken. Ms. Vance, please, Henderson pleaded. If we book you, it creates a record. It complicates things. It complicates things for you, Alara corrected. For me, it creates evidence. I want the full procedure. Process me, print me, and then release me on my own recognizance. Everything by the book. Because when I file my lawsuit tomorrow morning, I want the paper trail to be impeccable. Henderson looked at Miller with eyes that promised murder. Process her, he told Thomas through gritted teeth. And Miller, give me your gun and your badge. You're relieved of duty pending an investigation. Get out of my sight. The next 40 minutes were the most surreal of Alara's life. She was fingerprinted by a technician who apologized every time he touched her hand. She stood for a mugshot, keeping her chin high and her expression defiant. She signed the property release forms. Every officer in the room treated her like she was made of glass. They brought her water. They offered her a chair in the captain's office instead of the holding cell. But Alara refused the special treatment. She sat on the hard metal bench in the holding area right next to a young woman who had been brought in for shoplifting. What you in for? The girl asked, looking at Alara's suit. Waiting for coffee while black, Alara said. The girl snorted. Yeah, that'll do it. When the paperwork was finally done, Lieutenant Henderson personally escorted Alara out of the station. Ms. Vance again on behalf of the department. Save it for the deposition, Lieutenant, Alara said, stepping out into the sunlight. The city looked exactly the same as it had 2 hours ago, but everything had changed. I'll be in touch. She hailed a cab. She didn't go back to work. She went straight to the office of the best civil rights litigator in the city, a man she had watched argue cases for a decade. He was surprised to see her without an appointment, but when she told him the story, he canceled his afternoon meetings. You have the body cam footage, the lawyer asked. Not yet, Alara said. But I will. I know exactly how to subpoena it, and I know Miller's history. I've seen his name on warrant applications before. They're always thin on probable cause. He has a habit of hunches. We're going to expose all of it. The next morning, the lawsuit was filed. Vance versus City of San Diego et al. It was a masterpiece of legal drafting. It didn't just allege a bad arrest. It alleged a systemic failure of training and supervision. It cited the exact timestamps of the encounter. It cited the specific Fourth Amendment violations. The city attorney received the complaint at 9:00 a.m. By 9:15 a.m., he was on the phone with the police chief. Did we really arrest Alara Vance? The city attorney asked, rubbing his temples. Yeah, the chief sighed. And is the video as bad as she says? It's worse, the chief admitted. He tackles her frank. He tackles a 54-year-old court clerk who is standing still, and she narrates the whole thing like she's teaching a law school class. It's indefensible. The fallout was swift and brutal, but not in the way the police expected. Usually, they could control the narrative. They could release a statement saying the suspect was uncooperative. But they couldn't do that with Alara Vance. Her reputation was bulletproof. The federal judges she worked for were furious. The chief judge called the mayor personally to express his extreme displeasure that his clerk had been shackled. The body camera footage was released 3 weeks later. It went viral within hours. The contrast between Miller's aggressive, frantic bullying and Alara's icy, knowledgeable calm was striking. The moment where she predicted he would lose qualified immunity became a soundbite played on every news station. "Are you a lawyer?" Miller had asked in the video. "I work for the judges," Alara had replied. The internet loved it, but for the city it was a nightmare. Discovery in the lawsuit revealed that Officer Miller had stopped 40 people in the last year for suspicious behavior. 38 of them were black or Hispanic. None of them had resulted in a conviction for any crime other than resisting arrest. He was a predator with a badge, and the department had let him operate unchecked because his stats looked proactive. Alara sat across from the city attorney during the settlement conference. She didn't look tired. She looked ready. "We are prepared to offer $300,000, the city attorney said, "and Officer Miller has been terminated." "Terminated is a good start," Alara said, "but he needs to be decertified so he can't go work for the sheriff's department next county over. And the money. That's low." "It's standard for a wrongful arrest," the attorney argued. "This wasn't just a wrongful arrest." Alara leaned forward. "This was a humiliation of the judicial system. This was a message to every black citizen that even if you follow the rules, even if you reach the highest levels of government service, you are still just a body to be policed. The settlement needs to reflect the magnitude of that insult." She slid a piece of paper across the table. $1.5 million, Alara said. "And a mandatory retraining program for the entire patrol division on the Fourth Amendment curriculum to be approved by my office." The city attorney looked at the paper. He looked at the video playing on the screen behind her. He looked at the polling numbers for the mayor. "Done," he said. 6 months after the incident, Alara Vance stood on the steps of the federal courthouse. It was a bright, clear day, much like the one where she had been arrested. Officer Brody Miller was gone. He had been fired decertified and was currently facing potential criminal charges for falsifying police reports. The blue wall of silence had crumbled because Alara had the one thing most victims didn't, the receipts. The settlement money had hit her account a week prior. She hadn't bought a new car or a vacation home. Instead, she had established the Vance Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to providing immediate legal representation for citizens detained in pretext stops. And she watched the people walking by. She saw a young black man in a hoodie waiting for the bus. She saw a Latina mother pushing a stroller. She knew that for them the danger wasn't over. One lawsuit didn't fix a broken culture, but it was a crack in the dam. Alara took a sip of her coffee, a double espresso she had finally been able to enjoy in peace. She had been lucky. She knew that. If she hadn't been who she was, if she hadn't known the case law, if she hadn't had the confidence to speak up, she might have just been another statistic, another plea deal, another life ruined by a background check. That was the tragedy of it. Her justice came from her privilege of position. The goal now was to ensure that justice didn't require a federal ID card. She checked her watch. 1:00 p.m. Court was back in session. She adjusted her suit jacket, picked up her briefcase, the same one Miller had kicked, and walked back into the building where the laws were written, ready to ensure they were actually followed. The system had tried to break her. Instead, it had just reminded her exactly why she had to keep fighting it. This story isn't just about a bad cop. It's about the knowledge gap that exists between authority and the public. Alara survived because she knew her rights. But what about the people who don't? What about the teenager who gets scared and runs? What about the person who thinks they have to consent to a search? It makes you wonder. How many Brody Millers are out there right now looking for someone to bully? And how many innocent people are sitting in a cell today because they didn't have a federal badge in their wallet? If this story fired you up, or if you learned something about your own rights, do me a favor, hit that like button and share this with a friend. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to educate an officer on the law? I want to hear your stories. Stay safe, stay educated, and I'll see you in the next one.